The reason why the Trinity is so important is because the concept of the Trinity preserves the divinity of Jesus. If you don't believe in a Trinity, you cannot justify Jesus' divinity without becoming a polytheistic religion. Let me start off by defining the Trinity historically. When you look at history, one of the early creeds, later on in 325 AD, they established the Nicene Creed, which is what we call the Apostles' Creed. And it was during this time where they were trying to establish the Trinity, the concept of the Trinity in writing. And when you start to look at not just the Council of Nicaea, but other councils that came about from here, what you start to see is that in the first 300 years, you don't see the word Trinity or the concept of the Trinity written down or defended. Now, the reason why is not because they didn't believe in a Trinity. A lot of the things you have to understand about these old church councils is that they respond to the problems that arise historically. So, for example, inerrancy wasn't something that was written down until like the 1800s. Why? Because people weren't challenging inerrancy until the 1800s, and so the Christians were like, well, we got to establish this for future generations, right? Or the divinity of Jesus wasn't challenged until the first couple hundred years, and so now they have to write down exactly. Does that make sense? So it's not that the Christians didn't believe in inerrancy or didn't believe in a Trinity or didn't believe in a divinity. They had no need to. Or like even because of the rise of evolution, then the whole idea of like, creationism, that didn't become something until the past 100 years. Why? Because Darwin didn't exist, right, until recently, and then now the Christians have to respond. And so if you look back at old church councils, you'll never see a statement on the LGBTQ issue. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a stance on it. It just wasn't something that was needed to be written out, right? So be careful of that, because you might have people that say, well, Christians didn't believe in a Trinity for the first 300 years. Like, yes, we did. There was just no need to explain it because it was never challenged until 300 AD. And so when it first got challenged, it was through this view called Arianism. Arius, he was a theologian from the 300s. What he argued, and this is what the Trinity concept had to become established, because it ultimately has to do with your understanding of Jesus. The reason why the Trinity is so important is because the concept of the Trinity preserves the divinity of Jesus. If you don't believe in a Trinity, you cannot justify Jesus' divinity without becoming a polytheistic religion. So that's Arius. He is the reason why the church had to make a statement here. So what he argued was that Jesus and the Father, he said that they had a similar essence, but not an identical essence. They were similar. So Jesus was like the Father in his divinity, similar, but he was not equal to the Father in every way. Now, on the surface, the problem is there might be some people even today or Christians like, oh, that sounds about right. He's God-like. He has a lot of divine attributes like the Father, but he's not identical to the Father, because we always think the Father is number one, then Jesus is number two, and the Spirit's number three. There's a heresy, though. So the early church fathers are saying, wait a minute. If you say that Jesus is similar to the Father, then there's an implication that Jesus is a lesser God than the Father. And that is exactly what Arius was implying here. In fact, he argued that Jesus was a created being at some point. So he was an elevated angel, but he was higher than the angels, but he was a little bit lower than the Father. This is actually the view of Jehovah's Witnesses today, Arianism. So the early church fathers got together in a council and they started to say, no, they have not similar, but the same divine essence. The Father and the Son had the same divine essence. And this was put into writing in the councils. And from this point forward, the Trinity was something that was defended strongly. Now, here's another thing. When you look at early writings about the Trinity, the early church fathers could not define the Trinity exactly, but they were able to just put down what the Trinity was not. So a lot of times if you look at early church councils, they could not exactly explain how Jesus is 100% God, 100% man, but they were able to explain what it was not, the wrong views about it. So, for example, they would say, well, it doesn't mean that Jesus was 100% God and he looked like a man. That's wrong. It doesn't mean that Jesus was 100% man who became a God. That's wrong. It doesn't mean that Jesus is 50% man, 50% God that was mixed together. That's wrong. It doesn't mean that the divinity and humanity came together to create this third nature. That's wrong. Does that make sense? So they're saying all the wrong views, but they couldn't tell you exactly what the right view is, because this is where we get to understand that there are categories that we don't have for the things about God. Like, there is no category to explain Jesus perfectly. In the same way, there is no categories that humans can create to explain the Trinity perfectly, how God is one and three. But they did say it doesn't mean that it's one God who appears in three different ways. That's wrong. It doesn't mean that they're three separate gods, like a polytheistic God. That's wrong. And so if you feel like there's some vagueness to it, that's on purpose, because that's where the tension is. And it's hard to write down exactly how to explain that tension, because it's a tension. Like, how does the tension of God's sovereignty and human freedom work together? Theologians have tried to explain it, but there's always going to be a debate, right? Because it's how do you get that squishy middle defined? You can't define a squishy middle. How do you exactly explain the Trinity perfectly with one analogy? You can't use an analogy, because every analogy will break down into some heresy at some point. It's like, oh, it's like kind of like a family unit, father, mother, son. So who's the mother in this? The Spirit and Jesus' Son, but in the Father, Mother, Son family unit, one family, three persons, one person's created. Jesus is not created. Oh, it's like water. Sometimes it's gas, sometimes it's liquid, sometimes it's solid. That's modalism. That's like three different forms of the same essence, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't use the illustration for a Trinity, because you'll inevitably come to a wrong perception of the Trinity. So that's why I think it's important to study the early church councils and what they wrote down, because they spent many years. It wasn't like they got together in one meeting. They spent years, sometimes decades, trying to really formulate. And the sharpest minds looked through Scripture, and they said, we cannot exactly say this is how it works, but we know from Scripture these are all the wrong ways to explain it.